The Woofle Dust by Steve Duffy. It's a decent little engagement, what with the world situation. That was how Gerald Stackpole's agent, the lugubrious Raymond Duck, had sold the summer season on Hemsby Pier back in March. I admit it's not the Palladium, but it gives you a chance to feather the nest in case... And he'd waved his hand, vaguely, sketching the multiplicity of unknowns that 1939 might hold in store. And in that poky office, 4 floors up on the Charing Cross Road, it had seemed like a sound enough strategy. In Hemsby, however, at the wrong end of August, Gerald had his doubts. It wasn't the venue particularly. Gerald was fond of the Seaside, and you couldn't get much more beside the sea than a little theatre at the end of a pier. It wasn't the lodgings. The petty draconian rules and regulations were no more than one comes to expect in the business. It wasn't even the pay, which would hardly secure his retirement to the Isle of Capri, but which, if he was careful, and he nearly always was, should see him through the winter. The act, perhaps, was beginning to chafe a little. 2 houses per day, afternoons and evenings over a period of 14 weeks, add up to a lot of repetition. Still, Gerald could cope with the staleness. It was the increasing likelihood of something going wrong that was starting to worry him, the fear of being rumbled. The more you tempt fate, Gerald told himself, the likelier it becomes that fate will take the bait. Being caught out during the act is a potential engagement breaker, not to say career ender. The mind reader's performance takes place on a tightrope. It's hard to rest for a second when your show is so bound up with the reactions of the unwashed and unpredictable public. Stage magicians, who know their stuff and have checked their props, can wield the magic wand and thrust the daggers of Damazon into the box containing their assistant, safe in the knowledge that all reasonable precautions have been taken. Bring a punter up on stage, though, and you're opening Pandora's box. Anything can happen. These problems were part and parcel of life as Zimbo the Astonishing. Gerald had put in 10 years of professional mind-reading on the halls and had suffered no more than his fair share of cock-ups and blunders, none of them catastrophic. But perhaps, he was starting to think, 10 years might be enough, of Zimbo the Astonishing, or indeed of anything. He'd read a book once that said life was all about cycles, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever, and that when you came to the end of a cycle, it was time to move on. Now, with a war in the offing, might be the time to take heed of this dictum. Across Europe, people were averting their eyes while armies were mobilizing, reservists being called up, nationals advised to return home as a matter of urgency. Teams of labourers were busy filling sandbags on Hemsby's shingly beach, as if sandbags could hold back the onrushing juggernaut of war. The Stop Me and Buy One ice cream seller had decorated his tricycle with a placard that read, "Half a Mo Hitler, let's have our holes," and the pier's impresario, Mr. Morris Bambridge, had assembled the performers a week or so previously to explain that the summer season might be cut short at any time, in which case he would regretfully invoke the force majeure clause in their contracts. This provoked a certain amount of peevishness from the star attractions, the comedy couple of Filbert and Hardwick. Had they only known, they grumbled, they would have taken their booking being dangled by Winter Gardens at Blackpool, to which the irascible Mr. Bambridge had inquired whether they thought Herr Hitler's territorial demands stopped short of the Fylde coast. As for the other acts, Harry Budge and his tumbling monkey, the Doreen Simmons dancers, the North Norfolk Crosby, Dickie Cosworth, Percy Bulstrode and his Seaside syncopators, all the way down to balloon folder Frank Figgis, they nodded glumly and went back to their lodgings to top up their earnings and plan their next steps. On the day when everything came to a head, the last Wednesday in August, Gerald arrived at the theatre ahead of time for his first house. In a deck chair by the stage door sat, Maurice Bambridge, smoking a cigar the length of a stick of Hemsby Rock. At Gerald's approach he lowered a copy of the Daily Yell, open at a double-page spread on the Wakes Week murders case, which provoked the topical question, "Has Hitler scared off the Seaside Strangler?" "Stackpole," Mr. Bambridge enunciated, working around the cigar without removing it. "Afternoon, boss. Good house?" Mr. Bambridge grimaced. "Thin, very thin. No buggers risking it this week. Look there, on the prom. That'd be crowds as far as the eye could see last week of August. They're all at home digging bloody air raid shelters." "They might be well advised." Mr. Bambridge hailed from Bradford and did not mince his words. "Air raid shelters be buggered. Do you think a bit of tin sheet over a ditch is going to stop the bombers? Those poor sods might as well go on their holidays while they can, eat, drink and be merry. And that last's where we come in, Gerald, mark my words." He tapped his nose, and the ash from his cigar dropped on his newspaper. "I suppose so." From inside the theatre came the cheery fanfare that meant Frank Figgis had folded his last balloon for the afternoon. "Anyway, I'd best be off, Mr. Bambridge." "Good lad." The impresario turned the page of his Daily Yell. "Knock 'em dead." If the Hemsby Pier Theatre was compact, the dressing rooms were practically rabbit hutches. There was barely room to open the door without running slap into the dressing table. No space for a screen behind which the performers might change. Thankfully, all Gerald had to do was swap his tweed jacket and flannels for a DJ and dress pants, replace his tie with a clip-on dicky bow, and comb a dab of Brill-Cream through his hair. The reflection in the make-up mirror regarded him unenthusiastically. Nowhere could that grey reflection make out a trace of the skinny youth who'd received, one Christmas morning some 30 years ago, the Boy Magician's Manual of Prestidigitation. Author Bingo Kazam, mystic magician of international renown. That would-be boy magician, his spectacles forever falling down his nose, had spent the whole of the holiday in his attic bedroom, poring over the wisdom of Bingo Kazam. By New Year's Eve, he'd felt confident enough to try out a simple card trick on his family. From there on in, it had been magic all the way, and now that he thought about it, the whole of his subsequent career as Zimbo the Astonishing seemed nothing more than an attempt to recapture that sense of unalloyed wonder he'd felt all those years ago in that shoebox room in Streatham. Gerald sighed and rose to his feet. Away on stage, the Seaside syncopators were tootling sedately through a selection of popular tunes. Time for the magic to happen. He made his way along a cramped corridor lit with not enough 40-watt bulbs to the wings where Hector the stagehand was waiting. They exchanged a mock salute. When Zimbo the Astonishing took to the stage, Hector would be his invisible accomplice. Gerald's act this afternoon was a truncated version of his headliner show, a briskly executed mixture of stooge routines, a little cold reading, and what's known in the trade as the envelope trick or billet reading. You distribute among the crowd half a dozen sheets of notepaper with buff envelopes and ask the recipients to write something down before sealing it tight. The envelopes are collected and brought to the stage, whereupon you clasp them one by one to your forehead and exercise all the hidden powers of the mind, etc. You announce with suitable gravitas the contents of envelope number 1, and a cry comes from the audience, "Good gracious, that's my message!" Gasps of wonderment and a ripple of applause. Except, of course, it's not their message, it's something you made up, and the flabbergasted punter who claimed it, quite spuriously as her own, is in reality a plant. She is, in fact, one of the Doreen Simmons dancers, divested of her stage costume and got up in a dowdy frock, knitted cardigan and horn-rimmed specs. Once the applause has died down, you rip open the envelope and read the screed aloud, by way of confirmation. But what you're really doing is silently reading and memorizing a genuine message from a genuine punter. This message you announce while pressing envelope number 2 to your brow, and so on all the way through, each time eliciting a yell of recognition, authentic this time, as you recite the contents of the previously opened envelope. Ingenious. And, as performed for the pleasure of a mildly diverted matinee crowd, pretty seamless. Mr. Bambridge had not been kidding. The house was more than half empty, to the extent that Gerald was actively grateful for the presence of his stooge from the Doreen Simmons troupe. Over and above carrying out her designated task, she represented a significant percentage of the bums on seats. The last of Gerald's tricks, which called for the assistance of an audience member, would not afford him much opportunity to pick and choose. He cleared his throat beneath the last of the scattered claps and addressed the crowd. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, now comes the time where I invite a guest to join me here on stage and to open his mind to my mystic probing." The lighting walla set the spot to roam among the empty seats, searching for live bodies as much as likely punters. "Have I got a volunteer?" Gerald peered into the stalls. The theatre was too bijou for a circle, or indeed for much of a rake, and assessed his options. No hands raised. This was awkward, as it meant using his plant again and risking somebody spotting her later as she hoofed her way through south of the border with the rest of the chorus line. No, wait, it seemed he was in luck. "Gentlemen on the third row, if you would kindly come up and join me." The spot settled on a nondescript man with a toothbrush tash and a strangely penetrating squint. It tracked that gentleman out of his seat and up the wooden steps at the side of the stage. Gerald looked on benevolently, running a finger round the edge of his collar. The theatre's roof was essentially a shell of galvanized tin, and on sunny days like today, the stale air and the hot lights around the low proscenium combined to make him grateful for the brevity of his slot in the programme. "A big Hemsby hand of applause for our friend, Mr. The man did not answer at first. Gerald had seen this sort of thing many times before. In front of an audience, pinned in the spotlight, even the chirpiest, most effervescent types can find their heads suddenly emptying of the most basic information. "Your name?" he prompted kindly. "Swain," the man said in an effort. "Harold Swain." "Who is Sylvia? What is she, that all our Swains commend her?" The lines ran stupidly through his head, and Gerald dismissed them with an effort. "Concentrate, for God's sake." "Mr. Swain, Harold, if I may. Pleased to meet you. That's first class. Now, Harold, I'm going to ask you to assist me in this next demonstration of the powers of the mind. And what I want you to do, Harold, is to draw me a little picture." At stage left was a lectern, angled away from the eyes of the crowd. "If you'd be so good as to step up to the lectern there. Oops-a-daisy, there we go. There should be a sketching pad and a pencil. Just so. I shall take up my place here with my back to you. Now you will see that the lectern is so placed that whatever's on it is quite invisible to me." He craned ostentatiously over his shoulder, and the audience gave a little titter. "Nope, can't see a thing." This was entirely true so far as it went. Not only was the lectern angled away from Gerald, it incorporated a little plywood screen around three sides. Clearly this was designed to afford the maximum level of secrecy. Not so clearly, perhaps, the lectern was built just a little too high to allow Mr. Swain to rest his elbows while he made his sketch. Certainly his artistic efforts would be invisible to Gerald, standing downstage. However, anyone up above him would have a perfectly good view of whatever Mr. Swain chose to draw. Someone, let's say, hidden behind the proscenium arch, invisible to audience and guest alike. Someone who climbed the ladder to the end of the crossover beam from which the curtain hung. An eagle-eyed snoop, such as Gerald's clandestine assistant, the stage-hand Hector, who was even now in position and giving Gerald the undetectable thumbs up. All the heavy lifting in this illusion would be carried out by Hector, first spying on the sketch, then reproducing it in enlarged form and holding it up for the benefit of Gerald. All Zimbo the Astonishing had to do was raise his eyes to the heavens, or in this case to the backstage left wing, where help would be granted unto him. "I'll tell you what, I'll even put this blindfold on. How's that?" A few laughs from the audience. "Now there's absolutely no chance of me seeing anything." "Hello?" Gerald groped like the stereotypical blind man. "Hello, is there anybody there? You haven't all gone home, have you, ladies and gentlemen?" More laughs, but Gerald didn't feel justified in milking it. "To business, then. Harold, can you hear me?" "Yes," Mr. Swain said. His voice was hesitant, slightly roughened. From nervousness, Gerald assumed. Jolly good. Now, Harold, I'm going to ask you to draw me something. Just a drawing of the first thing that comes to your mind. You don't have to be Picasso or Leonardo da Vinci. Just a nice simple sketch, because I'm going to ask you to transmit it over the ether by means of thought transference. We don't want to complicate matters, do we? So, if you're ready, Harold, begin your sketch now. Gerald allowed a brief pause for inspiration to strike Mr. Swain, then spoke again. How's that sketch coming along, Harold? Have you finished it? No response. Just a nice basic drawing, Harold, that's all. How are you doing? Finished, said Mr. Swain, still in that slightly strangulated voice, as if his shirt collar was too tight or his pants hitched up too high. Jolly good. Now I want you to look at it very carefully for a few seconds, just to commit the whole thing to memory. Just an accurate mental picture of what you've drawn. This last for the benefit of Hector, to give him time to make his copy. Have you got that? Marvellous. Now I want you to fold that drawing up. Fold it up. Small, 2 or 3 times. And then I want you to put it into your pocket. Can you do that for me? Gerald waited. And when there came no sound of assent, he inquired further, Is it hidden away in your pocket now, Harold? Yes. Got a chatty one today, thought Gerald. That's smashing. Very well, I shall remove the blindfold. Suiting the action to the word with a flourish and turning round to face his psychic accomplice. Over at the lectern, Mr. Swain was looking at him curiously, perhaps trying to work out how he was about to be bamboozled, or else straining to be the best transmitter he could possibly be. And now, Harold, now comes the magical part. Are you holding a picture of that sketch in your mind? Mr. Swain nodded. Very good. Hold that image, Harold. Conjure up the image of that piece of paper in your pocket and that sketch, and imagine unfolding it to take one more look. Imagine it wafting away from you, as if on a breeze, Harold. Imagine it floating in the air between us. All this was what performers call the woofle dust, the folderol, the patter, the stream of psychic jargon that helps sell the illusion to the credulous. Hidden away in his eyrie, Hector was holding up his own sheet of paper. But Gerald would not allow himself to look at it just yet. All his attention was on Mr. Swain, and it had to be said, all Mr. Swain's was on him. Now, I want you to imagine that piece of paper blowing towards me. Blow it, Harold. Blow it with the power of your mind. Blow it over to me so that I can receive your sketch and see it in my mind's eye. The staleness of the shop-worn patter. Blow it over, indeed. At that instant, Gerald was thinking only of the end of the summer season, a break from all the old palaver, twice a day, every day. He was therefore entirely unprepared for what came next, which was that for the first time, ever, the trick came true. For the space of a few seconds, Gerald's consciousness of the stage, of Mr. Swain, of Hector up his ladder, of the audience down below, all of it melted away, and was swallowed up in a single, overwhelming visual impression. It was as if someone had grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, dragged him into some sort of void outside the everyday, and bent his attention on this one impossible thing. A vision, by God, floating in the air, exactly as he'd said. A revelation, for all the world, as if there really was such a thing as magic. Has Hitler. It had never before happened to him, not once. Gerald opened his mouth, trying to say something, keep running through the inane litanies of the woofle dust. But he could not. He blinked, but the image did not go away. It was still there, suspended in that void between himself and Mr. Swain, preternaturally sharp and vivid. In its presence, its absolute and ineluctable there-ness, Gerald felt nothing but horror. He'd always wondered how this moment might feel, and now he knew. It was petrifying. It turned your bones to water. He tried to speak again, and something even croakier than Mr. Swain's own suffocated tones came out. Harold? Has Hitler scared? Desperately, Gerald tried to refocus on the stage, on reality. Mr. Swain was staring at him with something more than recreational interest, more even than the intentness of the credulous punter. Gerald didn't know what was on his mind, and he didn't care to know. As of that instant, all he wanted to do was stop Mr. Swain transmitting, if that was what was really happening, to make the image go away, to get the man off stage with the minimum of delay. If this was magic, Gerald thought wildly, it was not something you wanted to mess about with. It was something that no amount of patter or stagecraft could restrain. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the Woofle dust. He was conscious of a tremor in his hand as he raised it to his forehead after the manner of Rodin's thinker. Get through the act and scarper, he told himself. Quickly, be a professional. Has Hitler scared off? And so the thinker closed his eyes and tilted back his head to indicate his utter absorption in the process of mind-reading. So far as Gerald was concerned, looking away from Mr. Swain and his cross-eyed stare seemed to clear his mind a little, break his focus on the vision. He opened his eyes again, just ever so slightly. In the darkness, behind the limelight, there was Hector, holding up his cheat sheet. For once the stagehand had sold him a little short. The drawing was rudimentary in the extreme, literally just a circle and a line beneath it, and might, under different circumstances, have led to some difficulty in the working out of the illusion. Was it a noose, upside down, with the loop at the top and the length of the rope below? It might have been a lollipop, almost, or an empty speech bubble, to represent his own inability to form words. But Gerald didn't need his cheat. He'd seen Mr. Swain's target image in the ether, seen it in such detail that to name it was child's play. Has Hitler scared off the seaside? It's a tie, he said, as if he was talking to himself. The simple act of saying it seemed to free him from the hallucination, bring him back on the stage, back in the performance, or somewhere even more real. Murmurs of interest from the audience. It's a tie, he said, more assertively this time. A man's knotted necktie. A simple schoolboy knot, what they called a four-in-hand. Gerald had been able to make out all the detail in his vision, even down to the pattern and the colour, the weave of the fabric. Murmurs increasing. Gerald forced himself to look Mr. Swain in the eye. Am I right, sir? The Seaside Strangler. Mr. Swain gave no sign of having heard him. His squinting stare remained fixed upon Zimbo the Astonishing. For his part, Gerald, although free now of that strange and terrible vision, was fighting back the nausea that every performer who's ever sensed the act slipping out of control will have experienced. Finish it, he was telling himself. Wrap it up for Christ's sake. Say something. If this was a proper theatre and not some tin shack on the end of a pier, there would be a trapdoor for pantomime season, and Gerald entertained a mad fantasy of disappearing from view in a puff of smoke. But it wasn't going to happen. This was Hemsby. There was no deus ex machina, and so he asked aloud, one more time, Am I right, sir? Is it a necktie? Pleading, almost entreating. Has Hitler scared off the Seaside Strangler? After an incalculable length of time, Mr. Swain nodded. It is? Gerald pressed him, till at last he said the words. A tie, yes. A tie. And if you could take the drawing from your pocket now, hold it up so the ladies and gentlemen can see it. Mr. Swain did as he was told, though it seemed to take him an age. Sporadically, at first, then more generally, applause came from the crowd. But neither man paid them any attention. Gerald supposed that he'd said, as he usually said, The powers of the mind, ladies and gentlemen. One last handful of the Woofle dust. A big hand for the gentleman, if you please. He must have said that because the applause had redoubled, and the Seaside syncopators had struck up his exit music. Had he said it? If he had, then that was all, and he could get rid of Mr. Swain. But Mr. Swain was going nowhere. In fact, he took a step forward, towards Gerald, and then everything slipped sideways once more, and the realm of magic opened again, like a pantomime trapdoor to the dark waves that sloshed and surged beneath the pier. The vision returned. A necktie. A necktie so like a hangman's noose, clutched in hands that did not tremble like Gerald's own. A necktie drawn quickly and brutally around a bare throat, biting into the flesh, the fabric all but disappearing as the knot was pulled ever tighter. The victim's face, why couldn't he see it? The waves beneath the pier, the blackness. Gerald bit down hard on his lip and forced himself back into consciousness. Hector, having shinned down from his ladder, was ushering Mr. Swain back into the audience. As the stooge disappeared into the shadows, Gerald felt himself overcome by relief. No longer did he feel trapped in the spotlight. Still, he didn't trust himself to make his usual full bow, to milk his applause. He stumbled instead from the stage as the clapping became haphazard and died away. He barged his way past Filbert and Hardwick, waiting in the wings in their washerwoman drag, away down the darkened corridors, making not for his changing room, but for outside, for fresh air and sunlight, for all those things inimical to magic and murder. That evening, Zimbo the Astonishing did not appear on the Hemsby Pier bill. Mr. Bambridge had intercepted Gerald as he burst out of the stage door, had in fact all but prevented him from going over the railings and into the drink. After taking a good look at the flummoxed mind-reader, he told him to go home and try to sleep it off, whatever it was. Gerald wasn't sure that you could sleep off an encounter with the numinous. For an instant the veil had been drawn back, and the secret fate of all existence had been dangled before him in the enigmatic form of a man's knotted tie. Whatever he'd imagined it might be like to be a visionary, he couldn't have guessed at this. Only the vision seemed real. By contrast, Hemsby seemed an illusion, a painted sea and cardboard seaside scenery, its streets filled with insubstantial shadows. Murder was real, and Gerald had been made privy to it. He tried to explain it to Sheila that evening. Sheila was his young lady friend in the parlance of the day. Not quite a lady, perhaps, and not precisely young, but they'd been keeping company since his arrival in Hemsby at the start of the season, and he visited her pretty regularly on those occasions when her landlady's back was turned. "It was awful, he said. "It's never happened to me before." How many lovers had said those words in that same rented room, he wondered, parenthetically, the way he'd so often find himself thinking of other things while in Sheila's company. How many thwarted amours washed up on the shores of failure and frustration. Man stuff, woman stuff, the common lot, a busted flush. "Concentrate, Gerald. Stop wool-gathering. This is serious." "Oh, Jerry," Sheila said, her eyes very wide. Sheila was a nippy at one of Hemsby's many tea-rooms. She was a trusting, better say credulous type, and a firm believer in the occult as it pertained to horoscopes and palm-reading. On this matter she took him entirely at his word, which came at no surprise. Part of him had hoped she might say it was all stupid and that he was imagining things, but really that had never been on the cards. She wanted to believe it all, seemed to want it far more than he did himself. She was daft for magic, thought Gerald to himself. Sheila's room was small, but the weak bulb in the bedside lamp barely lit up the corners. The red scarf she'd thrown over the lampshade for coziness' sake didn't help. In that rosy half-light, Sheila's face looked younger than its years, which was possibly part of her reasoning. "That man, do you think he might be dangerous?" "I think so, yes," he said. "It might be even worse than you think." Sheila started back on the edge of the bed, and the frame gave a little squeak in sympathy. "Oh, Jerry, whatever do you mean?" Gerald got up from his armchair and went to the door where his coat was hanging from a hook. From the pocket he took a copy of that day's Daily Yell. He opened it to the centre double spread and wordlessly held it up so that she could read the headline. "Has Hitler scared of—" "Oh, Jerry!" She seemed about to scream, and he quickly dropped the newspaper and gathered her against him. So long as her landlady might be around, he could never risk too much noise, not even the telltale creaking of the bed springs. When he was fairly sure she wasn't going to have hysterics, he held her at arm's length again. Her eyes were saucer-wide. "You think it's him?" "The Seaside Strangler." He spoke the words unwillingly. A stupid phrase, the yellow press at its bloodthirsty worst. He had no time for such hackneyed rubbish. "I don't know." He spread his hands wide. "I think it might be. It says here he uses neckties." "Because how else would you explain the vision?" Sheila rocked back and forth on the edge of the bed. "The tie, the strangling, the way he looked at you. It has to mean something, doesn't it?" "Yes, I think it must," he said, honestly enough. "There's only truth on the spirit plane," she said, and Gerald wondered where on earth, or elsewhere, she'd gleaned that scrap of information. "The spirits don't lie, only people lie." "I think," he said slowly, "I think what happened was he gave himself away. His intentions, I mean. His identity, I suppose. I don't know for sure, but it's obvious who he is." It was unthinkable to be saying these words, but they had to be said. "You mean—" And again Gerald had to move fast to smother her squeak of horror. Her words, when they came, were muffled against the linen of his dress shirt. "You mean the Seaside Strangler's here, in Hemsby, and he's going to kill another woman?" "It looks that way, doesn't it?" Gerald said, and hugged her tighter. It was all the reassurance he could offer. "It's ghastly." She pulled away from him. "Oh my God, Jerry, I've just thought of something." Her face, Gerald noticed, had gone quite white in the reddish glow. "What, love?" He knew what she was going to say, and all of a sudden he couldn't face her. He turned away, towards the dressing table that stood beneath the attic window. Unconsciously he picked up a discarded silk stocking and began to fold it round his open palm for neatness' sake. He found untidiness distracting. "Why would the vision come to you?" There it was. "Well, I am Zimbo the Astonishing," he said. It was a feeble enough attempt at humour, and she ignored it. "Because—" She couldn't get the words out, and then it all came out at once. "It's because of me, isn't it? Because you're linked to me on the psychic plane, and I'm next." Well, he hadn't been expecting that. He wanted to say how ridiculous, how egocentric, how incredibly self-centered to assume that the laws of heaven and earth would turn inside out to grant you a preview of your own destiny. He wanted to, but he couldn't, because even if it hadn't been for her benefit, it had been for somebody's, hadn't it? Wasn't that a reasonable assumption? The alternative, that it was just something that had happened without any raison d'etre, seemed altogether more of a leap of faith. If that was how the world was arranged, weren't we all hopeless cases? So instead of all that, he just said, "I don't know, but you mustn't worry." Aware of how fatuous it sounded, how like those brainless matinee heroes he so despised, he tried to reassure her. "I'm here." She wept then, big heaving sobs, and he held her tightly until she was cried out for the time being. The fog is lifted, he told himself over and over, while he mechanically petted her back. The veil is torn. Everything is different now. "Jerry, listen," she said eventually, wiping her eyes with his hanky, and again he found he couldn't properly face her. "We could leave town. Together, I mean. We could go to London. It's not the seaside, and he wouldn't follow us. I can get a job, and you've got your savings till the next summer season, or I don't know, Christmas panto or whatever. We could lose ourselves in London." The thought of Sheila accompanying him to London silenced him temporarily. It was not a thing he'd envisaged, and he didn't really care to envisage it now. Events were slipping from his grasp again, when it was so very important for the sake of his sanity that he keep control. He felt hemmed in, the way he'd felt on stage when Mr. Swain had been staring at him. He went to loosen his tie, but he'd already unknotted it, left it loose around his neck. The tightness he felt in his throat was there for another reason. The other silk stocking was hanging from the end of the bedstead. Gerald picked it up and began to fold it in the same way as its twin. Sheila began to pace the room, a thing that always irritated Gerald. She stopped by the dresser and stared out of the window, over the roofs of Hemsby to the pier and the sea. Gerald got up from the bed and came up behind her. Suddenly she screamed, and Gerald lost no time in clapping a hand over her mouth. "What is it, for heaven's sake?" "She, be quiet. You'll have the landlady in. Whatever's the matter?" "There's a man." Once he was sure she wouldn't scream again, he took his hand away. "Man in the street. He's got a Hitler tash, just like you said. Jerry, it's him. I'm sure it is. It has to be." Gerald felt for the lamp behind him and clicked it off. The twin bars of the electric fire were the only light left in the room. He took hold of Sheila around the waist, dragged her back from the window, and only then dared to peer down himself. There was a shadow right at the edge of the pool of light around the nearest street lamp. Already it was stepping back into the darkness, but he had no doubt who it was. The conviction seemed to leap from his mind to her own, as if Zimbo the Astonishing was sending, not just receiving, as if the magic had taken over, and could never now be turned off. "It's him, isn't it?" Sheila hissed. "That's the man, isn't it? Where is he? What's he doing?" "It might be," Gerald's voice was remarkably steady, all things considered. "I can't see him in any detail, but I'm pretty sure somebody's watching." She moaned with panic. Gerald pulled nervously at his collar. The room had become too small and too close, unendurable. He glanced down at the street again, seeing only his reflection in the window glass, and seemed to come to a snap decision. "What's at the back of the house?" he asked her, and again, when she didn't answer immediately, "There's a back alley, isn't there?" "Yes," she said, snatching eagerly at the implication. "Yes, there's a gate in the backyard. We can give him the slip. Get out of Hemsby. There's a train leaves at 11:15. We can just pack a bag and go." "No," Gerald said, and he slipped his arms around her from behind. "No, I think I've got to finish it. Once and for all." "Finish it?" she echoed. "Yes," Gerald said, and she could hear the conviction in his voice. "One way or another. It's got to end tonight." The fairy lights along the pier had been switched off, and Gerald wondered if they would ever come on again in his lifetime. The bulk of the 1,000-foot structure stretched out into the sea, its farther end invisible in the darkness, a bridge to an unknowable future. Jack, the night watchman, was sitting in the ticket office, reading the newspaper. "Has Hitler scared off the Seaside Strangler?" Gerald tapped on the glass, and Jack looked up in his own sweet time. "Evening, Mr. Stackpool," he said, getting up sedately from his stool. "Sorry to hear you was taken ill this afternoon. Have you seen the latest?" For an awful moment Gerald thought he was going to show him the headline of the paper again. But Jack was pointing to the sign taped across the locked turnstile. "Pier closed till further notice." "They wound up the season tonight," Jack explained. "Mr. Bambridge says he's been listening to the wireless. He reckons it'll be war by the week's end, and that's that." "Who knows, eh?" Gerald strove to keep his voice light, conversational. If that's the case, though, I'd best collect my things from the dressing room. I left—" he gave a rather forced laugh. "I left in rather a hurry this afternoon, you see. Can you just slip me through, please, Jack?" "Course I can, Mr. S. Half a mo." Jack took a bunch of keys from a hook on the wall of the booth and bent to the turnstile mechanism. "Here goes. I was just about to do me rounds, as luck would have it. I shall light you up as far as the theatre. I'll leave the turnstile unlocked if you want to nip straight back out when you're finished. There's nobody about anyway. Dead as a doornail. Has been all evening." Gerald thought of the shape between the streetlights, how it had seemed to know where, in all the windows of all the houses, to look for him. Aloud he said, "That'll be smashing, Jack. Won't be a jiffy." The turnstile clanked a stiff quarter turn to admit him, and another to deposit him on the pier side alongside the night watchman. Jack walked him along the unlit pier and handed over his torch at the stage door. "Here we are," he said, unlocking the door. "Don't worry about locking up behind you. I'll take care of that later. The electric's on, so you'll have a light once you're inside. Just remember to switch everything off when you're done and drop off the torch in me booth as you're leaving." Once inside, though, Gerald chose to find his way by torchlight. To turn on the overhead light seemed to be asking for trouble, and he thought it best not to draw undue attention to his presence. He slipped through the claustrophobic corridors to the dressing room, where he stuffed his few belongings in a grip. Glancing around to see if he'd missed anything, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror, and at first he took it for that dark and formless shape he'd seen from Sheila's bedroom window. He chose not to dwell on this image and stepped back out into the corridor. But clearly the shape was wily enough to anticipate the move, for when he flashed the torch back along the corridor, there it was, at the farther end by the stage door, blocking off his escape. It could have been Jack, of course, only Gerald knew it wasn't. He knew exactly who it was, and he turned and ran in the opposite direction, towards the auditorium and the stage. The noise of his footsteps seemed to fill the whole of the corridor, like the beating of hammers on an iron panel. He forced himself to stop for a moment and listen for sounds of pursuit. There were none, and he almost sobbed with relief. If he could only get to the front of the house, he'd be safe. Even if the doors were locked, there'd be a window he could unlatch, or smash if needs be. A click, abnormally loud in the darkness, and all the lights came on along the corridor. Instantly, Gerald was able to place his pursuer. The light switch, he knew, was situated at the side of the stage door. He had time to make his escape. He began to run again, and didn't stop until he ran headlong into a massive, yielding softness that smelled of dust and cigarette smoke. It seemed to envelop him like a shroud. The stage curtain. He was in the wings, and wide open space lay ahead of him. He scrabbled at the thick folds of fabric, managed to extricate himself, and stepped out warily onto the stage. Behind him, the lights in the corridor went out again, and everything was pitch black. Gerald did not dare use his torch. Instead he stood absolutely still and strained to hear. Another click, and back down the corridor the lights came on again. Click, click, and the footlights came on for a second, then off again. That's not the stage door switch, thought Gerald. He's inside. He's found the main panel for the lights. That means he's in the wings now. If he finds the right switch, he'll see me. Trying to regain his night vision, Gerald began to move downstage. He heard another click, and the safety lights in the walls of the auditorium came on, the dim, recessed bulbs that gave just enough of a glow for punters to find their way to the seats once the house lights went down. And in that creepy half-light, a figure stepped out from the wings. Mr. Swain walked gingerly, as if there was, indeed, a trapdoor that might swing open at any minute and send him plunging through to God knows what. Perhaps 5 feet out from the wings he stopped and cleared his throat. "Got you," he said thickly, and his squinting eyes never left Gerald's. "Got you now." Gerald did not answer. It was his turn to be lost for words. No slick patter, no sprinkling of the Woofle dust would help him here. Instead he waited until the other spoke again. "I followed you. I suppose you know that. I was outside your girlfriend's place earlier." "I saw you," Gerald said, as if speech came painfully to him. "And then I thought something was up, so I came here, and there you were at the gate being let in. I thought this was where you might run to. You were foolish to come back, really, weren't you?" Again Gerald did not answer. Instead he asked himself, was I, though? Perhaps I was, or perhaps he'd had no choice, really. What better setting for a denouement? One last performance, before the season ended for good. Mr. Swain was reaching into his coat pocket. He broke eye contact for a moment, and Gerald's hands went up towards his throat. "You haven't got it on," Mr. Swain said, looking up sharply. Gerald fumbled at his unbuttoned collar. His tie wasn't there. "You must have left it at your girlfriend's place," Mr. Swain said. "Another mistake." An image, shockingly vivid, flashed across the ether and into the mind of Zimbo the Astonishing. A tie wound around a neck, so tightly that it bit into the flesh. "Am I right, sir? Is it a necktie?" "You left your tie on Elsie's body, didn't you? A knitted blue tie." Gerald wanted to correct him. "Not a blue tie, a lovet, and her name isn't Elsie, it's Sheila. Look here, this is all a mistake." And then the name clicked. Elsie, the shop assistant, up in Skegness. Elsie, what? "You remember Elsie?" Mr. Swain had found what he was looking for. Gerald could see it now. A stubby little revolver, no bigger than a starting pistol. It could almost have been a stage prop. Has Hitler. Elsie. He raised his eyes to the proscenium arch, as if Hector might be waiting up there to feed him the answer. But there was no need. It was coming to him, as if by magic. Summer season, Skegness, 1935. Elsie. "Elsie Swain." Mr. Swain raised the gun and pointed it at Gerald. "My little sister, Elsie." Has Hitler stopped? "I don't—" Gerald's hands were still at his throat, feeling his Adam's apple bobbing spasmodically as he swallowed back the words. "She wasn't the first, was she? And she wouldn't be the last." There was no hesitancy in Mr. Swain's voice now. 6 women, and I dare say tonight makes it 7. Do you know how I got on to you? The newspapers in the libraries. I went through the lot of them, all the back numbers. It was a long job, looking at the what's on sections, finding out which shows were on in which town. Every time there was a murder, guess what? I narrowed it down to just one act that was playing every single time. The Seaside Strangler. It was you. Mr. Swain thumbed back the hammer of the revolver. "Where's your tie, Mr. Stackpole? Don't fiddle about like that. It's not around your neck. Where is it?" The nightmare of every performer. You're on stage, but you don't know your lines. Gerald's mouth opened and closed again, but nothing came. You've killed her too, haven't you? What's her name, that chippy you've been seeing? Just now, not half an hour ago. And you left your tie behind, like you always do. Gerald saw with photographic clarity his old Lovett tweed tie, wound round Sheila's neck. He heard the creaking of the tough fabric as he hauled on the frayed ends, felt the resistance as it tightened. His hands still ached from the exertion. From behind, you don't have to look them in the face, he thought randomly. Same with all the girls. He always came to loathe their faces. I could give you up to the coppers, Mr. Swain said. I could march you off to the police station right here and now, and they'd have a look in that girl's room, and that will be that. I could do that, Mr. Stackpool. He sounded as if he was playing a part in a third-rate talkie, Gerald thought. It was all just lines and mummery, a bad script from a hack writer, everybody going through the motions. All so much woofle dust, just what the audience expected and nothing more. How bloody tired he was of it anyway, sick and tired of it all. In his revulsion, Gerald found his voice at last. But you won't. No, Mr. Swain said decisively. No, I won't. This is for Elsie. And he fired the gun. Gerald had only attempted the bullet-catch illusion once or twice. It was a notoriously difficult trick to pull off, what with the loading of the blanks and the palming of the bullets and the reliability of the stooge in whose hands you literally placed your life. There had been casualties, too many for his liking. His left arm was stinging. He felt with his right hand and there was blood. Cornstarch, warm water, cochineal, the recipe to be found in the Boy Magician's Manual of Prestidigitation. Bingo Kazam, magic magician of international renown. Zimbo the Astonishing. Has Hitler stopped the Seaside Strangler? Mr. Swain fired again. The grave trap, a rectangular section of the stage around 6 feet by 3, often used in Hamlet, etc. It is usually positioned downstage centre. The performer may wish to conceal the operation of the trap with the setting off of an explosive effect. Funny that no one had mentioned a trapdoor. Gerald felt himself dropping down through the impossible grave trap, and there was no bottom, and he was falling endlessly. The waves beneath the pier. Has Hitler stopped the Seaside Strangler? The powers of the mind, ladies and gentlemen. Last show of the season. Finish it, wrap it up for Christ's sake. A big round of applause for our friend. The dark waves closing over him. Blackness. A shroud. Curtains, Hector.